welcome everyone. I'm going to start sharing my screen. There we go. So please put in the chat, and I'm hoping everyone can use the chat tonight. I keep thinking I have it right and it doesn't always work. Where you're viewing from? What birds are you seeing this week? And where did you see them? I'm going to put mine in and hopefully everyone will see it. All right, I'm not seeing anyone else. I may have to check.
Do you want me to do a test chat?
Well, here we Holly Elmore. Yes, we're getting it. Thanks, Holly. Viewing from Arlington Park, ibis and crows. So yeah, everybody's in.
Hi, Holly.
And
one of my
right now we have 50 people in already. So
Carol Breedler from Tacoma, Washington. I know you're going to log in tonight, so if you would just put in the chat, maybe some of those super birds you've seen out there in Washington State, that would be great.
Oh, Carol's on. Carol, where that was for you. Margie saw a robin in Lakewood Ranch. I had 75 at least.
That's not fair.
Yeah, well, it's winter here. David Granvalise was at Oscar Shear and saw scrub jay. Good. They're getting more and more rare, unfortunately. Cindy Elitzer. Hi, Cindy. North Lido, lots of seagulls. Gulls of different sorts. Debbie Cowett, Sandhill Cranes in Sarasota. Fun. Marianne Lilly. Hello from Siesta Key. Carrie Sheridan, good evening in Sarasota, seeing big flocks of ibises around. Dolores Hoppy from Lakewood Ranch, many tree swallows over the pond.
Oh.
All right. Now, let's see, we're up to 65. We'll give it another minute for folks to get settled in. Margie wants to know, is anyone seeing white pelicans? Jenny, Sherry, Sarasota, welcome. Lisa DeFrancesco, lots of wood stork and black vultures.
There's Carol Breedlove.
On or near roads around Sarasota. Carol Russ. Oh, ruby crowned kinglet. Wonderful.
That's
so you're up in
Carol.
Washington State?
Yep.
Okay. Barbara Males and Osprey. A few butterbutts, if you know what those are. The yellow rump warbler in the front yard oak. They're fun. A good assortment of pond birds in the backyard. Andy Kasarski. Love seeing the wood storks. Cindy Escher just arrived from Maine. She's seeing sandhill cranes and mockingbirds at Lake Ridge Falls in Sarasota. Deborah Hill, no, we're not muted. You are in a webinar, so you can only text in the chat. So no worries. Margie saw 3 white pelicans flying over Benderson during the Christmas bird count. Good, they got in. Marianne Lilly, yes. White pelicans on waterway in Siesta Key. And Dolores Hoppy saw them in Del Webb, 4 large white pelicans. Jenny Cherry says many black and turkey vultures. Lisa DeFrancesco seeing white pelicans in Sarasota Bay on the sandbars. And Ann Brooks from Osprey, Florida mixed flocks coming through. Jenny Steindem is listening in from Venice. Jenny Cherry, small, fast flying birds with some yellow on tummies. Yeah, some kind of warbler.
Or waxwings, maybe.
Or waxwings. They have, oh.
Could be.
A big group with a crest, with little crest on their heads. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Jenny also saw some white pelicans while crossing the bridge to Palmetto on Christmas Eve. All right. So the white pelicans are here. Great. We're up to 76 attendees. It's really good to see you all. And I'm going to turn it over. Well, first, let me give you some housekeeping details. For those of you who are new to our meetings, this is a webinar, so you won't be seen or heard, but you can put anything in chat. And we ask that Q&A for our speaker, please put in the Q&A. If you notice on your bar, either top or bottom, it has both chat and Q&A. So anything specifically for the speaker, please put in Q&A. But Margie and I will monitor them both at the end of the program so that we will be able to discuss John McCarthy's talk with him. So we will have a short meeting and then we'll get right to our speaker. So I will turn it over to Jean.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Wonderful to see you, the first meeting of January. Happy New Year to everybody. The Nature Center is getting busier and busier every day, and we know that January and February are our busiest months. So we hope to see you all out there. In spite of the weather, tomorrow's going to be kind of an iffy day, but that doesn't stop the birders getting out there. I just want to let you know that an update with Pam Calendar, who is giving free advice and free workshops on the second Saturday of every month at the Nature Center. Pam is she's everything. She's an artist and she's a landscaper and of course a specialist in native plants. She's with the Sarasota chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society. And I have found out that her workshops are actually filling up very, very quickly. And although we don't have a pre-registration, we actually might have to develop that, because there's only so many people she can handle at one time. So we will see what's happening this coming Saturday and see what the numbers are like, and then we might have to institute registration. So a little word about John McCarthy, our wonderful speaker tonight. John was in charge of Parks and Rec back when we were in that nascent stage of trying to get the Nature Center organized, and he nursed me. He and his staff nursed me through the lease process, and it was an arduous process, but he kept saying to me, Jean, don't worry, it'll happen, just keep going, and he was absolutely right. And I can remember fondly his support of us, and that's really wonderful. I'm looking forward to John's talk today. As always, he's a wonderful, wonderful speaker. So I'm going to turn it over to Margie Haas, our program director, who is going to give you an introduction for John. So
it's my great pleasure to introduce John McCarthy, who has done many, many things and is well known in Sarasota for many things. Right now, he is vice president for regional history at Selby Botanical Gardens, as you can see the sign behind him. And he will talk about Bertha Palmer and Sons Sarasota Natural Legacy, including Myakka State Park and Celery Fields. So I could describe John's background and contributions in many, many ways. In 2017, Sarasota Historical Society designated him one of Sarasota's heroes of history, especially for his preservation work. And I'm going to read from the award from that biography because I think it describes him very well. So John is a hero of history for his personal passion for history and for his long career in public service in the areas of history education, research, and leadership. He served as Sarasota County's second official historian, beginning at age 19, and went on to have a 32-year career in county government. Oh, I wish you were still there. Where he was most well known for his work as general manager of Parks and Recreation until his retirement, when he took up new roles in the service of history and preservation. He's a frequent lecturer and conducts tours on water and land, creating memorable experiences for those who yearn to learn about the past. Additionally, he helps nonprofits in the area with strategic planning and board training so that volunteer organizations can maximize their potential and impact. And as Jean said, he's been really wonderful in befriending Sarasota Audubon and Venice Audubon, and considers it, I hear secondhand, John, you consider it some of your most important work. We really owe you a debt, getting the Nature Center land, working with Jean Doobie, get it leased, and you, I understand, emceed the grand opening of the Nature Center in the Jelks Butterfly Garden. So we're very, very happy to have you speak for us. Please take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, Margie. Well, I am so happy to be here with Sarasota Audubon. And so tonight, we're going to check out an aspect of legacy in our community. And I think that legacy is really the important thing here, because I'm known as a historian, but that's yesterday. You know, we're all concerned about tomorrow and the future. And I think that's where legacy comes in, because it becomes this bridge between our past and our future. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the program and see where it takes us. All right. So 3.5 years ago, Marie Selby Botanical Gardens adopted historic Spanish Point, where I was the executive director. And it's about the best thing that's ever happened to historic Spanish Point. And I think it's a great thing for Selby Gardens overall. They adopted their mission statement to say Bayfront sanctuaries connecting people with air plants of the world, native nature, and our regional history. So I'm so happy to be a part of the Marie Selby Botanical Gardens team, and it allows me to continue to share history with the community in a way that really, I think, hopefully enriches people's understandings of the community that we call Sarasota. I borrow images from all over the place. I like to give credit to people. There's a great site that the state of Florida runs called Florida Memory, where you can go and see many, many photographs. I love reading old newspaper articles at newspaper archives, and you can see some of these other sources that I used to put the program together tonight. The Palmer legacy in Sarasota really starts with Bertha Palmer, and I love this quote of hers. And it could be about birds, but it's not, but that's okay, because it's really about beauty. And she says, the most wonderful thing in the world is a garden. I found my one talent, if I have any, at Sarasota Bay. It is to watch beautiful things grow and see them blossom as I plant them. She was an outdoorsy kind of person, even though she was known as a Chicago socialite, an entrepreneur. And let's talk a little bit about her. But what we're going to cover tonight, a little bit of background on Bertha herself. We're going to talk about the Palmer Farms and try to explain how this came about, that a sawgrass turned into an agricultural area, turned into a stormwater facility, and then turned into a mega birding site. Talk about Myakka River State Park, because Bertha Palmer's family was involved in that. Talk about Spanish Point, because they were involved in that. Jim Neville Marine Preserve. And then I'd like to share just a couple of slides of what's going on at Selby Gardens. So let's talk about Bertha Honore Palmer. She was born in 1849 in Louisville, Kentucky. This is her father, Henry Hamilton Honore. And he was involved in real estate development, was one of the prime movers and shakers in Louisville, and then moved to Chicago, out to the Great West, as it was considered at the time. But he had educated his daughter. He had gotten Bertha involved in some real estate work, even when she was very young. They were exceptionally wealthy. And so she grew up as a wealthy person would at the time, went to the best schools, spoke several languages, played several instruments, and was exposed to arts and culture all over the world. Most famous, perhaps, for being the president of the Board of Lady Managers for the Women's Building at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. This was the first World's Fair where the accomplishments of women were recognized in their own building. And the women's building, which was conceived, designed, managed, executed by Bertha Palmer and the other Board of Lady Managers, was designed by a female architect. The interior design was by a female interior designer, and it was exclusively all about women's contributions to the world. In order for her to achieve this, she had to travel the world. She went to Europe. She went all over, encouraging other people to send their exhibits, send their representatives, so that this women's building at the World's Fair could be outfitted with the accomplishments from all over the world. This is her castle, her stone castle on Lakeshore Drive. By this point, and I've skipped over so much of her history, but at a party hosted by her father at a similar styled mansion, she met Potter Palmer. She was very young, too young to marry even then. But years later, they did marry. And Potter Palmer gave her the Palmer House Hotel as her wedding gift when they were married. A week later, it burns to the ground. Of course, he turned around and rebuilt the Palmer House. But in the 1880s, he started building this house. He thought it was going to cost $100,000. When he hit $1 million, he told the accountant to stop telling him how much it was costing. But this was the first of the big mansions on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, because he had actually filled in the marsh, not good for the birds, but good for real estate, and built this castle there. I won't say too much more about it because we've got a long program tonight, but suffice to say, the last party she hosted here, she invited 4,000 people. So this is the Columbian Exposition as seen from above. Frederick Law Olmsted was involved in the design. She had an opportunity to work with him. Her involvement in this World's Fair actually went beyond the women's building, but that's what she's most famous for in that regard. So fast forward 1902, her husband passes away. 1910, she sees an advertisement in the Chicago newspaper promoting citrus groves in Manatee County, which Sarasota was a part of. And that advertisement had been placed by Joseph Lord. And Joseph Lord had moved down to the Sarasota area in the 1890s and had bought up all kinds of real estate. And so he was looking to sell it to folks from the Chicago area. Now, this photograph is a great one because it shows the original house, the original part of the house that she acquired, which would now be located just north of historic Spanish Point in the Oaks subdivision. And this is the house that she called the Oaks, because you see these gorgeous live oak trees, and they're filled with resurrection ferns, and they're filled with butterfly orchids, and they're filled with birds, right? She falls in love. This property becomes hers. Here she is standing in front of the little hunting cabin that she would later expand in many directions. And she's standing with A.C. Honore, her brother. Now, you're going to hear about A.C. Honore later. That's why I pointed out now. But suffice to say, in 1910, when Bertha Palmer came to Sarasota, she was probably one of the most famous people, most famous women in the entire world. And here she comes down to Little Sarasota. I think the census population of the downtown area was like 860 people or something like that. Here's the house after she had a year to update it. And she expanded the house in different directions, started planting all kinds of stuff. We recently had an opportunity to do a tour over on the private property in the Oaks Bayside, and we confirmed these live oak trees are still there. It's amazing. It is so cool to see them there today. Well, Bertha Palmer didn't come here just to relax. In fact, she spent 8 years working hard, seemingly each and every day, to develop her real estate holdings, because once she bought that little piece in Osprey, she started buying more and more. Started out buying from Joseph Lord, bought everything south of Clark Road that he owned. Okay, so that takes in what's now Palmer Ranch, Osprey, a lot of Nokomis, Laurel, Venice, all the way down there. And then she bought out in the Myakka Lake area several thousand acres from Garrett Murphy, who was a cattleman who'd been around for years. And he sold his land and he sold his cattle. And the newspaper headline, when they interviewed him about the sale of the stuff, he says, "Tell him I sold my stuff. That's enough." Anyway, she convinces the Seaboard Airline Railroad to extend their tracks from Fruitville, which was the terminus in 1904. So this railroad came to downtown Sarasota in 1903. By 1904 was out to Fruitville. to service the early agricultural aspect of Fruitville community, and then ultimately ended up all the way down in Venice, 1911, 1912. And this is what we now call the Legacy Trail, built on the old railroad corridor. The image in the center is actually a photograph of the first locomotive to come here on the Seaboard Airline Railroad. And off to the right, this Sarasota and the Sarasota Bay District. That's what this was called. We were a part of Manatee County at that time, and Manatee County had 5 commission districts, and one of them was literally called the Sarasota Bay District. So that's the way that this area was described, Sarasota all the way down to Venice and even the Englewood area. And I love the very flowery terminology, a land with perfect climatic conditions where nature has eliminated winter from the scheme of life for the benefit of mind, body, and purse. Now, these are some advertisements that are pretty cool because this speaks to some of the first agricultural work that Bertha Palmer and her family did along the Philippi Creek in what they called the Hyde Park District. So they had the Bee Ridge development, which Bee Ridge is an ancient name that goes way back into the early pioneers, but she bought land there and developed it up as small farms. And then she talks about this Osprey subdivision here. And then over here on the right-hand side is an item that speaks about the Hyde Park Drainage District. So this was the beginning of the dredging of Philippi Creek, the beginning of draining lands for agriculture on a large scale, and essentially drained the lands that the Southgate community is today and converted that into citrus. So here's what was called the Hyde Park Citrus Subdivision. It shows Philippi Creek going down through the middle, and they did some early channelization there. And also they put in a weir because they wanted to keep the tidal water from coming too far up or north, because they wanted to be able to pump fresh water out of the creek to water the citrus. And so some of you might be familiar with like Southgate Community Center, and that's where the weir is behind there. It's no longer functioning to hold the tidal water back, but that was their idea in the first place. And then if you look at this, you'll see that the engineer on this project was J.G. Kimmel. He would continue to work for the Palmers and would be involved working for the Sons out in the what we now call the Celery Fields area. So, and again, this is just, an old postcard view showing the old citrus. Somebody asked me the other day, they were visiting from out of town. They said, John, where can we see a citrus grove? Oh my, where can you see a citrus grove anymore in the Sarasota area? Out in Tatum Ridge, that's about it. But anyway, I love old citrus product labels. Once they had color lithography in the 1890s, they started making these fancy labels. And so here's one from the Palmer Corporation, Sunway, oranges and grapefruit. It's got some palm fronds on there, makes you feel like you're in Florida. Now, these crates of citrus would go up to New York and Chicago, and they'd literally open them right there. Every piece of citrus is wrapped in tissue paper. It's got this beautiful label, and it just sucks you in and makes you want to buy some of those oranges. And then this one I thought you all would really enjoy. This is a super rare label, Palmer, Florida Company, Philippi River brand, oranges and grapefruits with the nice white egrets in the image there on some mythical Philippi Creek, I guess, or Philippi River as they were calling it then. So these probably date from around 1920 or so in that era. So let's talk a little bit about what we call the Celery Fields, but we can't talk about the Celery Fields without talking about Fruitville. Fruitville was founded by the Reeves family, R-E-A-V-E-S, in 1868. And this is a little item from an 1897 Manatee County directory. It says Fruitville's 11 miles southeast of Bradentown and 2.5 miles from Sarasota. Surrounding land, fine pine and sawgrass. Finest peaches in the state are raised on sawgrass lands, the trees bearing at 2 years from planting. Now, wow, 1897 growing peaches in the sawgrass, I don't know. I'm thinking they were on the edge of the sawgrass. And you can see the postmaster was Charles Reeves, the man I mentioned to you a minute ago. He and his wife, Rebecca, were the first pioneers. And you can look down and see the Bates and the Hands and the Platts and the Rawls and the Reeves and the Tatums and the Tuckers. And you can see these names around Sarasota because they got streets named after them because these were the early pioneers that were out there in the Fruitville and Bee Ridge area. So where was Fruitville? I mean, I think that's a good question. This is a little sketch that was drawn up by an old friend of mine, Eula Tucker Lastinger. And she was a member of the Tucker family that came right behind the Reeves and settled in the Fruitville area back before the last turn of the century, the one back there. And she wrote a little book called The First 100 Years in the Life of the Friendship Baptist Church. And that's out on Palmer Boulevard now. It used to be down where the SCAT, or should say the new County Breeze bus system, transit system down off of Pinckney Avenue. That's where the original church was. But anyway, if you look at this map, you can see McIntosh Road, Bay Vista, Fruitville, and even Proctor Road. And so the Reds and the Rawls living down toward Proctor, that was more of the Bee Ridge community, the Bee Ridge set, as they called them. And then you got north of Bay Vista, and that was kind of the Fruitville area. And you had the Reeves living way up there off of Simmons. That's just a little bit east of McIntosh. You see the Fruitville School, the store, and the post office. You see the Tucker's houses there. Anyway, then they had the Live Oak School down here on Bay Vista. And what they would do, they'd run like the Live Oak School one year, and then they'd have the Fruitville School the next year, and sometimes they'd go back and forth. So anyway, that's kind of a cool map. And then here's one of the promotional brochures put out by the Seaboard Airline Railroad. And this is about 1913, I think, and got 700-acre cornfield in Fruitville. So that could very well have been taking advantage of some little muckland. And then you got 30 acres in cucumbers down there on the lower section. So that was taking advantage of some nice rich soil as well. So usually when we think of Fruitville, we think of citrus, but they were growing all kinds of stuff out there. And then here's just some articles that we don't have time to dwell on here, but I just kind of wanted to show you how they were really promoting this area for agriculture. It says vegetables are also grown to some extent around Sarasota, although not so extensively as the other places up the road. They must have been talking about Manatee County. They talk about the rich hammock land. They talk about the sawgrass land and how some of it's been drained, even at this early years, leaving, you know, and so this is kind of where we're at. But this is an image actually along the Tamiami Trail. But I wanted to show you what the old roads in Sarasota used to look like. This is actually Fruitville Road after improvements. This is when the road had been what they called hard paved, which basically meant was packing down the dirt and spreading some oil on it. And you can see the telephone poles. And those telephone poles went from Sarasota to the Reeves house in Fruitville, and then out to Augusta Wilson's house out in Myakka. They were the only ones that had phones. And here you have this automobile coming down Fruitville Road. Eula Lastinger Tucker told me she thought this photograph was right about where the school is, Cardinal Mooney there, right in that area. You see, they didn't have as much traffic congestion back then. Now, this is one of my favorite maps, and I'm so glad I included it tonight. This is the first map ever drawn of Sarasota County when we split from Manatee County. And this is just a portion of it because I'm focusing it up here on the northwest corner. But here you can see downtown Sarasota. You can see that Lido Key was called Sarasota Key at the time. You see Longboat Key up there on the upper left. Siesta Key was called Little Sarasota Key at that time. And then that's where we get the name Little Sarasota Bay, Little Sarasota Pass, and those sorts of things. And then look out in Fruitville. You can see right where it says Fruitville, just to the left of that, Little Camp Sawgrass. So the Camps were a family that owned a lot of this agricultural land and a lot of the sawgrass land between 1900 and 1911 when they sold out to Joseph Lord, who ultimately sold to Bertha Palmer. And that Little Camp Sawgrass is basically Bobby Jones Golf Course, which is now part of a conservation easement. So that's pretty cool. And then you've got the Big Camp Sawgrass. And if you're seeing the same view I am, you might not be able to see the end of it where it says Sawgrass, but that's what's now the Celery Fields. And so because the Camp family owned this land, it kind of came to be known as the Little Camp Sawgrass, because that one was smaller, and then the Big Camp Sawgrass a little bit out to the east. Notice that Fruitville Road does not go straight out to Myakka. It takes a jog, and then it goes out more along the lines of where Palmer Boulevard is. So that's kind of cool. Bee Ridge Road, in this case, ends at Sawyer Road and then goes down to Proctor, which ends at what would now be McIntosh. So I love all these old maps. And if you look far enough down there, you see where it says Bee Ridge. And then there's the Alford Sawgrass. That's also named for a very early pioneer who was here in the 1880s. And the Alford Sawgrass are the ponds on both sides of the intersection of Clark Road and Beneva Road, where there's a great bird rookery over on the south side in what they call Mirror Lake. And that's the old Alford Sawgrass. So that got dug out. Instead of drained, it got just excavated out and built up the land around it for housing, whereas the Celery Fields got drained for agriculture. You see Philippi Creek coming up here, and this is kind of the last map that's going to show Philippi Creek in its tremendously modified way. Now, we talked about Bertha Palmer. She dies in 1918. She accomplished a lot. She created a model cattle ranch out in the Myakka Lakes. She did very innovative things with her cattle. She introduced hundreds of plant species to her country estate at what's now Spanish Point. She convinced the Seaboard Airline to build their railroad down to Venice. Her family was very much involved in the push to create Sarasota County. And that was because, as I said earlier, that Sarasota Bay District was one of 5 county commission districts in Manatee. It represented 45% of the tax base of Manatee County, but they only got 20% of the money because they just divided up the money equally between the 5 districts. And the frustration with that and the desire to build roads, have better schools, and do other types of improvements is what led to the creation of Sarasota County. And once Sarasota County was created, boy, the Palmer family was ready to go because they wanted to drain more of the sawgrass. They wanted to build more roads. And so they proposed something very similar to that early Hyde Park Drainage District, where they created the Fruitville Drainage District as a special taxing district, so that the people that owned the land adjacent to the sawgrass and the Philippi Creek would get taxed to collectively pay for the dredging and what they called the improvements. And so that's what happened. And this was founded in 1923 is when it was established. So that's 100 years ago this year. So you could literally say that the Celery Fields in its altered form is basically started 100 years ago this year. And this article talks about what they're going to do. Well, they ultimately ended up, the idea was $600,000, and they're going to drain 8,000 acres. 2,000 of those was the black, rich, organic peat muck that became later the Celery Fields. They established the Palmer Farms Growing Association because the Palmers didn't want to be farmers. They wanted to sell land to farmers. They wanted to put in the infrastructure, the roads, the drainage, and get the site prepped, build the packing houses, but then they wanted other people to actually grow the crops. So that's kind of cool. Work actually didn't start on this until 1924, which is this article's from October of 24. So it took them a little while to get the plans together. Again, Kimmel was involved, the same guy that was involved with the Hyde Park District. And then they did the first plantings didn't occur until 1927 or so. And the first crop that was harvested was tomatoes and potatoes. They hadn't gotten to the celery yet, but they created an experimental farm. And maybe I'm getting a little ahead of the story. I do want to point out, though, if you any history buffs out there, that as they were digging out the Philippi Creek for this project, they discovered a mastodon bone with a stone arrowhead or a projectile point embedded in the bone where it had grown around the point. And this was earth-shattering in terms of the understanding of early man in Florida back in the 1920s, because they figured Native Americans had been in Florida for several hundred years. They didn't dream that they were here at the same time as the mastodon, the mammoth, and the ground sloths, and all the other critters that were here. But here's this bone, here's this projectile point, and the bone's growing around it. Well, J.E. Moore was the archaeologist who discovered this, kind of a paleontologist, but he went on to find human remains very close by, and he called them Philippi man. And he sent it off to a museum, and they lost the bones, and it was controversial because they were trying to prove that man had been here in Florida, you know, at least 10,000 years ago, which was preposterous at the time. Of course, now we know that people were here in Sarasota County 12,000 years ago, well documented at Little Salt Spring. But here's the ditches being cut. Now, if you drive roads in Sarasota, if you go Bay Vista through Pinecraft, you're driving through, you can see the creek that was dredged out. That's not the way Philippi Creek used to look. That's all the canal that was dredged out to straighten the creek, to make it deeper, to drain basically the agricultural lands. And there's so many places in Sarasota where you have opportunity to see this. Here's a little brochure for the Palmer Farms, the fertile acres of Palmer Farms. And by the way, this was produced by the Sarasota Chamber of Commerce. So back then, it wasn't just about luring businesses to Sarasota, it was about promoting agriculture, and here we see some of the crops in this particular image. And here's the inside of the brochure. And up here in the upper left-hand corner, I know you can't see it too well, but that's the experimental farm station. They hired a guy named Ed Ayers, who was the Manatee County agricultural extension guy, and they hired him to work for Palmer Farms to figure out what can we grow here. And they just started planting everything. And that's why they had the experimental farm. And the entrance to that was right where Richardson Road kind of comes off of Fruitville Road on the west side of the interstate. Before you get to the interstate, you see some cows out there. You see people picking some different crops. You see down at the lower left, you see one of the big old packing houses. When I was a kid, you went down Cattleman Road, it was like one lane wide, pothole on pothole, high crown in the middle. The school bus would jump all over the place, and those packing houses were all lined up there. Here's another image showing some more of the packing houses and some more of the crops and stuff. And this is late 1920s. Estimated more than 2,000 carloads of celery will be shipped this year. So basically what they figured out was that muck soil was best for growing the celery. Now, I wanted to show you this map because the Historical Resources has this map, and I was fascinated by it because it shows all the drainage basically of the sawgrass. And you see this was drawn by Kimmel, and it's color coded. And the color coding has to do with the type of pumping mechanism that was used. So this is a Mengi pump, and Mengi was trying to drain areas in Louisiana to grow rice. And he developed this highly efficient pump that would work to move water up low, just short areas, and he could move it up, move it up, move it up. So the coloration that you see is all of the blue areas are served by Mengi's new pump, which was kind of an innovation. And then all the pink areas were centrifugal pumps, more similar to the pumps that we're used to seeing today. So in this case, someone has put on here Palmer Boulevard. You can kind of see that. And you can see some of the experimental tracks that they had here, and you can see the different coloration. But clearly, a lot of engineering went into this. Here's kind of the eastern side of it. You see Fruitville Road cutting through here, and you see that they were farming on both sides of Fruitville Road. This is what it looked like in 1948. I love looking at these 1948 photographs. In fact, you can go to Google Earth and click a little button now, and you can see aerial photographs going back in time. So if you're interested in this stuff like I am, you could spend all day checking out different parts of Sarasota. But this kind of just speaks to how much the land was altered. Took those old sawgrass lands that had been there literally for thousands and thousands of years and turned it into this crop agriculture. This is a fascinating image. This is from an archaeologist who got involved back when they were draining the sawgrass, and he documented where the canoes were found. Now, I know back when the Celery Fields were being developed as a stormwater facility, there was a lot of talk about things being found in there, mastodon bones and all kinds of stuff like that. But the canoes were preserved by the organic peat in the muck. And so on the far left, there are two canoes, one 18 feet long and one 15 feet long, both finished, but badly decayed. They were no doubt, they were hundreds of years old. Down at the bottom, how about this one? 16-foot, perfect canoe, pulled out by tractor, later destroyed. Now, it wouldn't hold up well once it reached the oxygen. Once it came out of that muck, it wasn't going to survive. And then over here to the right, 16-foot finished, but badly decayed. And then this one up at the upper right, 15-foot unfinished with the end burnt off. So many people believe that some of these dugout canoes were made by setting fire in the wood. Maybe this one got out of hand and it just got burned up, never got. Now, this was a map drawn by a guy named Montague Talent, who was here in the 1930s. And different people have put their opinions on this map as to where it's located. Some people think it's the Bobby Jones, the Little Camp Sawgrass, and other people, including our current county archaeologists, believe it is the Big Camp or the Celery Fields Sawgrass. But just so you know, and I got this little image down here of Native Americans in a canoe that was drawn by a French artist who was here in the Americas early on, and just kind of goes to show that sawgrass was a lot different back then. And so I got to move along and make up some time because we've got other bases to cover here, but I wanted to show you this promotional brochure again from the 1930s. And if you just look at the whole county, there's a couple areas hatched. Down south, it's the Venice Farms, developed by the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, and up north, it's the Palmer Farms. So here again, you can see that. And it was a huge, huge operation. I mean, this was just a massive part of Sarasota's agricultural development. Here's another one from a few years later. And this one I love because it just kind of shows the Bee Ridge Groves, and then it shows the Palmer Farms and Bobby Jones and the Ringling Brothers Circus and all that. And anyway, Myakka State Park shows up on this one. So this is from the 1940s. Here we got a little closer view of, again, orange groves in the Bee Ridge area, the Major League Baseball downtown, the trailer park, the reptile farm, which was off of Fruitville Road, Texas Jim Mitchell's reptile farm, the airport that used to be where the veterinarian is now, opposite Robart Sports Arena, Ringling Art School. Pretty cool map. So I wanted to show you these. This is Burke's Fancy Celery from the Burquest part of the area. So like I say, the Palmers sold land to others. Burquest was one, Stockbridge as well. Some of you might recall Dorothy Stockbridge. She used to write articles for the Herald Tribune. She did the real estate section. This was her family that was growing out there. And then Fancy Farms. Pat Ferlisi bought quite a bit of land from the Palmer Farms and created Fancy Farms, which continued to grow celery. And they went to the pre-cooled celery, where they would really freeze the celery in the boxcar. They'd cut all that celery, get it in there nice and fresh, freeze it, and then send it up to New York and Chicago. And then here's just a couple of postcard views. Now, granted, what the Palmers did here was not enhancing wildlife habitat or doing anything positive for our ecosystem. I think what's cool about the Celery Fields is what's happened to it since. And again, just early images. If anyone wants one of these postcard views, they're for sale on eBay every day for a couple of bucks. This guy, there's like 10 of these for sale on eBay right now. But you see the cut celery, and you see how neatly they're packaging it, and then they frost freeze it and then send it up north. This is a nice black and white view. And the muckmobile, they had to have these special vehicles to operate out there, or they would sink in the bottomless peat muck. And then this photograph was taken by Marion Post Wolcott, who was a photographer that came here in 1939. And these are some Amish folks out there. The Amish community of Pinecraft exists in Sarasota because of the Palmer Farms. Amish people happened to come down and camp around the sawgrass, saw the development of it, saw the farming potential, started moving down and settling in the little trailer park that was there on Bay Vista, and that turned into Pinecraft. It used to be called the National Trailer Camp. But anyway, it became Pinecraft. Here's another photograph taken by Marion Post Wolcott. She was hired, by the way, by as part of the Works Progress Administration. She was hired as a photographer to document the improvements to the agriculture in the South that were created by basically the New Deal and all the different funding projects. And for those interested, that's a 1937 Dodge pickup. And then, this is pretty much what we look like today. We've got Audubon Nature Center right in the center there, and the ponds that have been dug out to hold the storm water, and of course, surrounded by industry, the interstate, housing development, all these other changes that have occurred over the years. And yet somehow, the restoration of this as a water retention area resulted in kind of a flashback to the original days of birds and birding. So let's talk about Myakka River State Park. This is one of the largest state parks in Florida. It was one of the earliest state parks in Florida. It came about because of the work of a number of people, but most of these two, Judge Paul C. Albritton. Albritton names very common in Sarasota area, and A.B. Edwards on the right. And A.B. Edwards actually was working with Joseph Lord and was the first person to show Bertha Palmer around Sarasota back in 1910. Well, they approached the Palmer sons, and the opportunity was that A.C. Honore had passed, and he actually owned about 17,000 acres out there along the Myakka River. And so the state internal improvement fund was kind of pressured by Edwards and Albritton and the other people down here who were all part of kind of a sportsman wildlife conservation effort to buy that 17,500 acres from the estate of A.C. Honore. Now, this is 1934, and they did that. And then 2 weeks later, after that deal was closed, Honore and Potter Palmer Jr. So this is Potter Palmer Jr. on the left, Honore Palmer on the right. These are the two sons of Bertha Palmer. They gave 1,920 acres to the state, just gave it in memory of their mother, Bertha. And this was land between the upper lake and the lower lake, and took in a lot of what most people see when they drive through Myakka State Park. Those who never leave their car, they see the part that the Palmers own. There was another 9,000 acres owned by the Curry family that became a part of the park. There was acreage where people had not paid their taxes on it, became a part of the park. And there'd been some foreclosed lands that became a part of the park. So, but the 1,920 acres, which they called the old picnic grounds, because Bertha had established some camps out there. She put a Delco generator out there where you put in diesel and you could have electricity. And so that was kind of the family camp. And that all became the nucleus of Myakka River State Park. And if you go out there, there's this huge boulder, and it's not too far in the entrance. It's kind of near where the cabin pavilion is, the log pavilion. And this is the marker there that talks about how it was created by the Florida legislature in 1935. That was a good year, wasn't it? And now at that point in time occupied 28,000 acres. And then it talks about the donation of the 1920 acres in memory of Bertha Palmer. And anyway, it also mentions Paul Albritton, Jack Crawford, A.B. Edwards, Ivy Taylor. Ivy Taylor was from the Bee Ridge area there, and that was dedicated in 1966. Now here's one of the little cabins being built out there, and they were smart enough to put them up on little pilings a little bit. And you'll notice this is an African-American workforce. When the Civilian Conservation Corps came down to Sarasota to build Myakka River State Park, they announced they were going to have an African-American work camp. And the community objected to that. They said, no way. And Civilian Conservation Corps said, fine, then you don't get a park. And the community said, okay, you come and build a park with whoever you want to build a park with. So this was one of the few African-American work crews in Florida, and they built the pavilions, they built the cabins, they built most of the things that most of the visitors to Myakka Park see and enjoy today. And actually, Robert Dye, who was the longtime manager of Myakka River State Park, I can't remember if it was the late 80s or early 90s, he had a reunion, and he was able to welcome back 13 of these men to have a celebration there at Myakka River State Park. So I think that's pretty cool. And then here's the whole, the supervisors and the workers out there under the nice Spanish moss festooned live oak trees. And of course, you can't do anything at Myakka without finding an alligator. And then this is 1941. This is actually the dedication of the park. This was a lot of work had been done. They had planted a lot of trees. Probably some of them they shouldn't have planted because Robert Dye and others have spent a lot of time trying to get rid of all the trees they planted. But they built bridges, you know, and all the other stuff. But by 1941, it was really coming around. And the gentleman to the furthest right is A.B. Edwards. Now, this guy was a native Sarasotan. He remembered when they first put the stake in the ground at 5 Points. He had been raised up by the Wilson family out in Old Myakka because he was orphaned as a young boy. He ended up being in real estate, insurance, and all this other stuff. They called him Mr. Sarasota in his latter days. But here he was so proud. You know, the person who had kind of convinced Bertha Palmer to invest in real estate in Sarasota had now convinced her sons to get involved in creating this state park, which is kind of fascinating. So here are some views, and I've completely lost track of time, so I'm going to pick up the pace here a little bit. But this is from the fire tower on the west side of State Road 72, and you're looking at the original entrance road and the original ranger station kind of right there in the middle. And then here's that ranger station. This was the simple entrance to Myakka State Park back in the day. Of course, one of the feature areas there is the birding. And here's the boardwalk and binoculars and checking out what birds we can see that day. Here's the main road going along through some of that property that was part of the property that the Potter Palmer Jr. and Honore Palmer had donated. Here's the sign for Myakka River State Park, 10 miles. Look at the road, folks. Those were the old days. And I love these photos. Look at all the birds at Myakka River State Park. And, you know, it's so hard to find photographs just of nature and wildlife. You know, people took photographs of buildings and cars and railroads and people, but it's really unique to have nice photographs of birds. And we see a number of different species here. And then here's another one. Again, these are at Myakka State Park. These are in the state of Florida collection. I love this one. What a camp. Look at those oak trees. Look at all the cabbage palms. Look at these. Look at the serious construction of that picnic table. And it looks like the woman to the right-hand side is sitting on like a seat out of an old car or something like that. Very unusual. At any rate, that's how you had fun at Myakka, I guess, back in the early days. There's the river itself. This is this photograph was actually taken by the director of state parks at the time, which of course today we completely frown on people feeding the wildlife, but back then it was pretty common and apparently even encouraged. And then this one kind of dates itself. It's a 65, 66, 67 Mustang, and you got the gator there for the stop sign, and things are getting a little fancier there at this point. So Meadow Sweet Pastures is what Bertha Palmer called her model cattle ranch. I could do a whole program about that, so I'm not going to say much more about it. But what was her Meadow Sweet Pastures is now Myakka River State Park. And if you go out there today, you can still see this sign hanging over one of the trails going off, and it's Meadow Sweet Pastures. What a cool name. And here's Myakka, and I know most of you are probably familiar with it. But, you know, most people that visit Myakka River State Park never leave their cars, or if they do, it's just to walk up the bridge to see the gators or to walk on the canopy walk or to get on the boat or something like that. There's a lot more to Myakka Park, as many of you know. So let's wrap that up. Let's talk about Spanish Point for a couple minutes. You saw this photograph before. Spanish Point was Bertha Palmer's house. This is the Gupto house, one of our feature properties there now. And this is, we thought this was Bertha out in front of it. Now I'm not so sure. But at any rate, she used this for a guest house. And today, this is where we educate people about history at our place. Here's her sunken garden and pergola under construction in 1912. She did extensive garden work. I believe created what might be one of the first Edwardian style gardens in America. Haven't been able to find any older. And that's a subject of a whole separate program. Here's a nice watercolor by an artist named Robert Chase, who lived here in Sarasota. This is the aqueduct. This is one of people's favorite things when they come to visit Spanish Point. Here's an orchid on the orchid walk. And this is an interesting piece of art because it was done after a fire had come through and kind of blazed out the pine flatwoods that were east of the oak hammock. And you can see the burned out woods behind, and you see the blooming cultivated Cattleya orchid there in the foreground. And then these are just some photographs of Spanish Point, and it's kind of cool because she owned like, you know, hundreds of acres down there on the bay, and we ended up with 30 of it. And most of what you see here in treed is what we ended up with. And most of what you see without a lot of trees is what became the Oaks subdivision. And so this gives you a great view of the point, and it gives you a view of Duchesne Lawn, which is in the center, and the beautiful hammock, which is, and the other thing I should say, and this should not escape us, is that virtually everything here that has trees on it is Indian mound, made by Native Americans, stacked up over thousands of years. And here's another view looking the other direction out toward the point. And just a fascinating site. This is Gordon Palmer. He's the grandson of Bertha Palmer, and he got out of World War II, came down to the property. It had been abandoned for years, and he opened up the house and spiffed it up and opened up the gardens and created the Palmer nurseries and started planting lychee trees. He was the president of the Florida Lychee Growers Association. He encouraged archaeologists, Ripley and Adelaide Bullen, to come down from Gainesville. They were associated with University of Florida. They did the first archaeological work here. They found the oldest pottery in the Americas at that time. Now, since then, they found older pottery. But in 1959, 61, 62, that was the oldest pottery that had ever been found in the Americas. And they carbon dated, which was very expensive then, back to almost 5,000 years old. And that wasn't even at the bottom of the oldest mound. But this is a great shot of Gordon Palmer there underneath the live oak tree. And this is Spanish Point today. Most of the green that you see to the left, and where you see the homes is other parts of the Oaks Bayside. And so the Palmer family owned all this, wanted to basically sell part of it to a developer to develop it as a residential community, but wanted to save the core of the Indian mounds and the pioneer homes that were still there. And there were the foundations of other buildings that were gone. We've subsequently rebuilt those. And so it was a little bit of a cat and mouse game because, and again, I could do a whole lecture on it, but suffice to say that the approval for the development happened simultaneous with the donation of the 30 acres to Sarasota County, which then donated to Gulf Coast Heritage Association, which is now part of Selby Gardens. So that's how it all came to pass. And I'll tell you a funny story as we move. Oh, so I've just got a few shots here of some things at Spanish Point. If you haven't been down to Spanish Point, come and visit us. It's beautiful down there. It's one of my favorite places in the world. And directly adjacent is the Jim Neville Marine Preserve. So on this particular photograph, in the middle, you're looking at the Oaks and North Creek, which is a beauty spot all in itself. You got Selby Gardens, Spanish Point campus down at the bottom, Conservation Foundation just south of us. And then you got Jim Neville, all this area to the west between the south end of Siesta Key, the north end of Casey Key, and Little Sarasota Bay. And I've got some other images. So here we are kind of looking out toward the Gulf, and you see this massive area that on the 1883 maps was called Bird Island. And in fact, the Webb family, the original homestead pioneers at Spanish Point, they didn't have to have chickens. Once a week, they went over to the island, got a bucket of eggs, all different kind of eggs. They said they were delicious. They'd go get turtle eggs too. And anyway, but here's Jim Neville Marine Preserve. Now, Jim Neville was an early environmentalist here in Sarasota, was a county commissioner, wrote an article for the newspapers and stuff like that on environmental issues. And when he passed away, this was named in his honor. But this was all donated by the Palmer family right around the same time as the Spanish Point was donated. And they sold a little bit of land out here to the county, as I recall, for the Palmer Point Park on the beachfront. But this is a beautiful photograph. Now, you've got a combination of mangroves, a little bit of artificial salt turn from the dredging of the Intracoastal Waterway, because when they dredged the Intracoastal Waterway, they spewed up all the dredge material in this part of the bay into the center of the Bird Islands, and then the Australian pines started growing immediately. So the tall trees you see are all Australian pines. The low trees that you see are mangroves, and the sandy areas are kind of an artificial salt turn formed where the dredge material spewed, and it's too salty to grow anything else, I guess. And you know, this I heard a rumor the other day that there's going to be some work to finally start restoring some of this into more of a natural state. But people kayak around this all the time. This is one of the places where I most frequently see a roseate spoonbill and reddish egrets. And there's a bird island out here with a very healthy rookery on it. So this is a fascinating part of the legacy. And here you can better see the Australian pines and how they've kind of choked out the whole center portions of the set of islands here. And you can see some of the shoreline areas. The birds just love this area. And then this is the Point condo that you're seeing over here on the left side, the southernmost condominium on Siesta Key. You know, we do little boat tours of this area, and people are just amazed at the bird life, the fish that they see, the rays that they see, the dolphins that they see. This is just a wonderful part of Sarasota Bay. I want to tell you this story. I'll pause on this just for a minute because we're almost done, but I had the opportunity to meet the member of the Palmer family that was most instrumental in the donation of the land, and his name was Art Woods Sr. And I met him when I was Parks and Rec director because he wanted to tell me that the donation of the property said that it would remain in its natural state forever, and he didn't want to see campground there, and he didn't want to see restrooms out there, and that if we built that, he would sue Parks and Rec and the county. Well, at any rate, I got talking to him and found out that he'd honeymooned in Sarasota, and he told me the hotel, and he said he always wanted a photo of the hotel. So I said, well, I got a photo of the hotel. I'll mail it to you. So he gives me his card, and it says Art Wood Sr., Sears Tower, Chicago. That's all it said. I said, well, sir, this is great, but how are they going to get my letter to your office? He says, well, I'm the chairman of the board of Sears Roebuck. I think they know where my office is. Well. Let me tell you a little bit more before I tell you about what's going on at Selby Gardens. I want to point out that the Palmer legacy in Sarasota continues. Little organization was founded a number of years ago called the Sarasota Conservation Foundation. Now it's the Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast. It's founded by Albert Yerger and Pauline Wamsler, who's the great granddaughter of Bertha Palmer. When historic Spanish Point had come upon hard economic times, and this was right at the beginning of COVID, and we started talking to Selby Gardens about them adopting us and kind of saving us from our financial situation. The chairman of the board of trustees was Pauline Wamsler. And so to this day, the Palmer family is influencing the preservation of lands, the conservation of lands, and that's why I called this the legacy of the Palmer family. Again, our mission statement at Selby Gardens has been expanded to include the air plants that it's always been famous for, but also native nature, which is embodied by the Spanish Point campus, and our regional history, which they kind of got with the Spanish Point, But I want to tell you, Selby Gardens is all about the future too. And this is our vision for our downtown campus. And this week, we're doing our grand opening of our phase 1 of our thing, which is our solar panel covered parking structure, our living energy access facility that's going to generate more power than we're going to consume. So we aim to be the first net positive energy botanical garden in the world. We aim to have the first net positive energy restaurant in the world. We're growing vegetables on the roof using disabled veterans from the area to then provide fresh food for the restaurant. We have our new plant research center. This is all hurricane hardened. It's elevated. It's climate controlled. We've got our herbarium for the first time in 50 years. All of our staff will be together. All of our collections will be protected, and we're opening it this week. So if you're a member of Selby Gardens, you can come on Wednesday. If otherwise, you come later in the week, and the whole thing's going to be different. Anyway, our next phase is glass houses, so we can put our living collection protected from hurricanes. This is all about sustainability. Selby Gardens works all over the world. This is a map of the partnerships that we have for collecting, for preserving specimens, for sharing specimens. And we literally have partners all over the world in the botanical realm. I want to tell you some of the fun things you can do. We started this a couple of years ago. You can take a boat from Selby Gardens down to Spanish Point and back again on a Saturday. It's a lot of fun. Just go on our website and check it out. If you're not into the big boat with a lot of people, but you want to have a more intimate experience, we kicked off these tours last week on our magic boat. This is a replica of the original boat that served the property back at the turn of the century. And 6 people can go out for about 45 minutes and just have a great little delightful time on the bay. If you haven't heard already, everybody's flocking to Spanish Point right now because we have the Clyde Butcher exhibit. And for the first time ever, Clyde's work has been printed on sublimated aluminum panels, and they're about the size of a sheet of plywood, and they're put outdoors. This is the first outdoor exhibit of Clyde Butcher, who's considered, the photographer of the Everglades. And it's amazing, and people are coming out in flocks to see it. And we are cranking up, 2 days ago, looks like we started our 20th anniversary of the Rainforest Masks of Costa Rica. Basically, you come and you buy these beautifully painted balsa wood masks, and the revenue from this keeps this village in Costa Rica going all year long. So we've been doing this for 20 years. It's amazing. If you've never seen it, come and check it out. And we've got a new art exhibit coming up, and it's Kusama, a letter to Georgia O'Keeffe. This is going to be another one of these art exhibits in the Botanical Garden at downtown campus that's just going to be amazing. And so that's coming up February 11th. This is our new Welcome Center, our new lily pond. If you go there this week, you will see that the finished product looks exactly like the artist's rendering that I'm showing you here, which is almost 2 years old. Very rarely do you see a project that gets to the end and looks exactly like it was envisioned in the future. So I think with that, we'll open it up for questions, and we'll fill in any gaps that we need to fill in.
All right. There's-
Wow.
Well, I'm breathless, John. Are you?
Yeah.
That was absolutely wonderful. Okay, Margie, go ahead with the questions.
All righty. So questions. Who were the first two men in the photo portraits? I think you referred to them again later.
Oh, Potter Palmer Jr. And so that's Bertha Palmer's first son, and Honore Palmer. And so if you think about that for a minute, there's a Potter Road in Sarasota, there's Palmer Boulevard, there's Honore Avenue. These are all named for that family, and these are the people that they're named for. Potter Palmer Jr., he died much earlier than Honore Palmer. Honore lived to be like 93 years old, I think, and was in Sarasota for a very, very long time.
And
All right, what else do we have?
How did Philippi Creek get its name? Who
Oh,
was
that's a fantastic
Philippi
question.
and from where?
So, and it's kind of so let me tell you how Spanish Point got its name. So this family's coming down from New York right after the American Civil War, and they end up in Key West because they took a schooner from New York and it was heading up to Cedar Key. They stopped in Key West, and when they were in Key West, they met this Cuban fisherman, and there were Cuban fishermen that were camping all along the shores of Sarasota, catching fish and taking turtles off the beach and sending it all back to Havana. And so this guy told him about this place where the land jutted out into the bay. It'd be a perfect place to build a home. So when they ultimately found it, they wrote a letter back home, said, "We've arrived at the Spanish Point." Okay, so that's how Spanish Point got its name. Even though the Native Americans have lived there for thousands of years, we don't call it Native American Point, but you get what I'm saying. Now, between the 1750s and the 1850s, there were a number of these fishermen that lived along the shoreline here when Florida was owned by Spain, when Florida was owned by Britain. And one of them was a gentleman named Philippi Bermudez. And Philippi Bermudez's fish camp was where Cherokee Park is today. And for some reason, Philippi Creek took his name. So when the early surveyors came, he was the only person living around. So you go, well, that's Philippi's Creek. So that's how Philippi Creek got its name, from one of these early fishermen. And Philippi's camp was there in the 1840s. So he was amongst the latest of these fishermen before you got into the Homestead, the Armed Occupation Act era, and then the Homestead era. Yeah, so thank you for asking that question.
So how did they drain the sawgrass? Could you briefly describe the process?
Well, they did it with drag lines on barges. And they started down below and they worked their way up Philippi Creek because they had to start where the water could flow. So they channelized Philippi Creek and made it straighter. And if you kayak Philippi Creek, you can obviously see the ditch areas, but you can also find some of these old remnants of little oxbows and stuff like that. The best one is behind the shopping center that's at the northwest corner of Bee Ridge and Tuttle. It is amazing wildlife back in there. Anyway, they did it with drag lines on barges. They had occasion to use explosives sometime to get through some hard rock, and they worked their way up, and then they just kept cutting through. I'm talking about the 1920s effort. There was an 1880s effort that involved horses and men, and there were some other efforts that involved more rudimentary forms of dredging. But this was a massive project. They dug with precision. They had it all engineered and surveyed, so all the canals would drain correctly. They had those two different kinds of pumps, the centrifugal pump if they needed to pump it up higher. They used the Menge pump if they only needed to come up so far. Yeah, so at any rate, that's how they did it. And it took, like I say, the Fruitville Drainage District was approved in 23, started in 24. They didn't really start growing anything until 26, 27. And that's one of the myths that's out there. A lot of people, you look at some of the stuff online, and it's like they were growing celery there in 23 or 24. It's like that. It didn't happen that fast. And remember that celery was not the first crop. It was tomatoes and potatoes.
Somebody's asking, can you expound more on the old oxbow? Is it preserved?
Yes, launch your kayak at Philippi Estate Park. Go upstream, go underneath Bee Ridge Road, and discover for yourself. I mean, it's really just a little natural areas that just were kind of impacted by the dredge, but not totally wiped out. And there's just little areas like that you can find in different places. There aren't a lot of them, but they are there. And then once you get up beyond Pinecraft, it's just ditch, But it's not difficult to kayak from Philippi Estate Park to Pinecraft.
Yeah, you see people kayaking all the time from Pinecraft, that little launch place.
But if you do it from Philippi up to Pinecraft, then you can have lunch in Pinecraft and then go back down to Philippi.
Karen, I had a question from Ann Brooks, but it went away.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I typed it and I didn't realize when I typed it. She was asking for the reference for the Florida memory. Can you expand on that again, John?
Sure. That's all you need. If you type Florida memory into your browser, you'll get it. And then you'll see that you can look at maps, you can look at photographs, you can look at manuscripts. If you look at photographs, type on that little icon. You can then type in any word you want. Ringling, Palmer, it's not a fast system. You have to wait for stuff to load. Makes someone like me very impatient because I just want to see the next photo and the next photo and the next photo, but it doesn't work that fast. But there are many wonderful photographs there of Florida, and it's all copyright free. You can use it for anything you want. And it's a great go-to source for any historical stuff. There's a lot of more modern history in there too. And it lacks a lot of critically important things that it just doesn't have in its collection, but everything that it has is available. And in fact, the current director of the county's historical resources department is who has really helped to populate that in Tallahassee before he came here. And he's starting to do that now with Sarasota images. So you're going to have a lot more access to Sarasota images as well.
Where is that location?
Well, that's at the county historical, that's at the Sarasota County's website, libraries and historical resources, and you kind of go from there. So it's when I first started doing research on Sarasota history, you had to read the old directories, read the census, talk to the old timers. Now people do research just by typing away. The only thing that you have to be careful about is bibliographic echo, where one person says something, it's incorrect, but everybody copies them anyway because they don't know. So I spend half my time debunking stuff that isn't quite right.
Where is the physical location of the Historical Society? Is that near SCAT?
Well, the Historical Resources Department is currently at the Osprey Schoolhouse that used to be the headquarters for Spanish Point. And Josh Goodman is the name of the gentleman that runs it. Somebody just put that in the comment. I didn't mean to leave Josh's name out, but at any rate, thank you for that prompt. And Osprey Schoolhouse, I think they're open Monday through Thursday, and you can just walk on in there. But they don't have their entire collections there, because they have them in a remote location. So you go tell them what you're looking for, and then they can order it up for you. Maybe a week later, you can come back and check it out.
I'd like to ask about Celery Fields and the arsenic and Celery Hills, Celery Mountain.
So before I do that, David Harper says to everyone they're open Monday through Saturday. I can't acknowledge that. I don't think they're open on Friday, but the library might be open on Saturday. I don't know, and I apologize for that. But they're not there on Friday when I go there on Friday. Your question about the mound of soil. It's my understanding, and I'm not an expert on this, that the soil in the celery fields was so rich with chemicals from the fertilizer, from the herbicides, from think of all the tractors out there and everything else, that it was going to be considered like toxic waste. It was going to cost millions of dollars to dispose of. And instead, they decided they'd temporarily stage it there in a big pile. That's my understanding.
So it's not just temporary there. They put a liner. It's well engineered. It's covered with clean soil. So it's safe to go up and down and to be around because it's heavy metals that are stuck in there. So it's a designed place to just hold that soil.
Thank you, Karen.
Yes. There's one other question. Barry Gerber asks, with Uzi Baram now on staff at Historic Spanish Point, will we see an increase in archaeological digs?
Well, digs are not what we're all about. That's, digging is like what the Palmers did to the sawgrass and ruined it the first time. What you will see is a completely new way of interpreting our history. What you will see is Dr. Baram working both downtown campus and Spanish Point campus. You'll see him continue to be involved in the Angola project on the south side of the Manatee River. You'll see him continue engaged with the Seminole tribe of Florida on virtually everything that we do. But yes, you probably in the next couple of years will see a dramatic increase in the opportunities that we have for sharing Native American culture and archaeology type work with the community. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Baram working with us. I've worked with him and partnered with him for I think the entire time he's been here in Sarasota, and we have high hopes. And we've got a lot of work to do. But he's already making an impact. We've already got some partnerships we're working on that are brand new to us. And so we're going to try to do what Selby Gardens has done with orchids. We're going to do it with Florida history.
I'm sorry, what institution are we talking about? It sounds extremely important. I didn't quite catch the name of the institution.
Well, it's just a person that someone mentioned. I had the opportunity to hire Dr. Uzi Baram, who retired from New College after 25 years as their archaeology professor, and he had created the public archaeology lab there. He is one of the authorities who was working with Vicki Oldham and a group of others to document this free African-American community that existed on the south side of the Manatee River in the days before the American Civil War, back in the 1820s. And they actually were able to document the location of it. And every year there's a festival, and there's still descendants of the people that live there in the Bahamas, and they come back to visit. And so this is an amazing cultural exchange, between the 1820s here and the Bahamas now, and all documented because people cared to see what was kind of below the surface in that case. But again, to comment on the individual that asked if we'll be doing more digging, there are some opportunities at Spanish Point to do some limited digging to understand a few things better. But Spanish Point's been dug into so many times, and we really need to stop digging and start studying what's already been dug and focus on how to interpret that for people so that they can understand things like there are still Native Americans living in Florida. That this was a sustainable community. I mean, I said it from the stage of Van Wezel. For 5,000, 6,000 years, people lived in harmony with our local ecology. And then the story changed. And the story started changing in the 1880s, and the story's been changing ever since. So Uzi and I are looking forward to working together with me kind of on the history side and him kind of on the archaeology side, although we both share interests on both sides of that. So yes, thank you for pointing that out.
That sounds very
Selby
exciting.
Gardens is very happy to have him on the team.
Very exciting. Ann Brooks asks, did Bertha's cattle operations create lots of change in the landscape?
Well, she certainly changed the way cattle were managed. I'll give you an example. Back in the old days, there were no fences, and everybody branded their cattle, and the cow hunters would get together and they'd mammy the calves, which meant that if that calf was with that mother, it got the brand of the mother. And it was all on the honor system, And Bertha Palmer, being a landowner, she said, well, I got to fence my property. And I'm going to drain the wetlands, and I'm going to plant corn. And she built 6 196-ton capacity silos out there, which never got used because every time she tried to go corn, it would flood out. And what she missed was that the Myakka River provided all the food those cows needed if you just let the cows move as the river came up and nourished all the wetlands and the grasslands, and the river would go down and the cattle could come and eat. But at any rate, what she did do, which probably allowed us, if you like to eat beef, you're happy that Bertha Palmer had meadow sweet pastures, because she found a way to deal with the fever tick that was killing all the cattle. and that was to dip them in arsenic bath in these
Ugh.
dipping vats, which there's a bunch of those out at Myakka River State Park. And everybody said she was nuts, that the cow were going to die. Instead, it killed the ticks. And in the 1930s, this saved all the cattle in Texas. They started doing what she was doing in 1916.
Wow.
So she was the one that was brave enough and bold enough to kill those ticks without killing the cattle. And I have seen it in print that it's one of the reasons why people still eat beef today.
Wow.
Now, that might be an exaggeration, but I just read it the other day, and I think I read it online, which means it has to be true.
John, since you have such a broad and deep perspective on everything, I want to ask you a wacky question. When I moved to Sarasota, so many people told me that there's a big crystal in Sarasota Bay, and it actually protects us from hurricanes. And you can see, at least with Irma, the hurricane sort of more or less stopped right at what's now the Sarasota border. And that American Indians would collect in Sarasota because it was safe because of this big crystal in the bay. And that's why the beaches have quartz crystal, which does not conduct heat. Is that true in your opinion or your knowledge?
Here's the thing. And you know, I'm kind of like interested in history in a way. I've been thinking a lot recently about how short people's memories are. You know, like if you ask someone what their grandparents did for a living, they probably don't know. If you ask them what their great grandparents' names are, they do not know. People's memory is very short. And if memory was long, they would tell you about the 1848 hurricane that was hellacious in this area. They might tell you about the 1910 hurricane that wiped out all the docks down in Osprey, and they might tell you about the 1921 hurricane that wiped out all the docks at Bayfront Sarasota, put water up toward 5 Points. They might tell you about the 1926 hurricane that put Siesta Key under 6 feet of water, the same way that, you know, the one down there put Fort Myers Beach under so much water. Maybe the hurricane from the 30s would come to mind, the Labor Day hurricane that also had an impact on Sarasota, or one that came in the 40s, or even Hurricane Donna in 1960, but nobody remembers them. So there's this big crystal in the bay that keeps all the hurricanes away because nobody remembers that we had hurricanes here. Now, I'm not a meteorologist, but you look and you see the behavior of Charlie and some of the others. You got Charlotte Harbor's a big heat sink. You got Tampa Bay's a big heat sink, and it kind of sucks them in there. So we might benefit a little bit. But if we think that we're protected from hurricanes by a crystal in the bay, we might as well just go hang out with that crystal. As far as the quartz sand on Siesta, you know, it's ancient. It started in the Appalachians, come down the Mississippi River. You know, it's 99% pure quartz. Yeah. They had it analyzed as early as 1907 by the clerk of court in Manatee County. He documented it was quartz. National Geographic documented as quartz. Dr. Beaches documented as quartz. Everybody's documented as quartz.
From the
as is the sand on Lido, as is the sand on Longboat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
But really, you know, what keeps the hurricanes away is the positive vibrations emanating forth from a very special place on Little Sarasota Bay called the historic Spanish Point campus of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens.
Right, and your wonderful attitude, plus keeping the wetlands is a really good idea.
Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you enough, and we keep getting all kinds of messages thanking you for your wonderful, excellent, intriguing, fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for being who you are and protecting and developing and encouraging our historical perspectives on this wonderful place.
Well, thank you so much for what you do. I mean, you know, one of the things that's most powerful about Audubon in Sarasota, whether it's Sarasota Audubon or Venice Audubon, is that you all are using county lands that are owned by the taxpayers, and you are putting them to work in an amazing way. Education, preservation, economic development. You know, our image has changed because of these things. You know, the bird rookery down there near Robert Anderson Center down in the South Venice area. I mean, the Celery Fields. And so, you know, it's one of the reasons why I like working with Gene Doobie so much and others is that you all take something that the county has, an asset. And in the case of what we call the Celery Fields, a stranded asset. And you've, through education and your own elbow grease and your own money and your own members and your own time, mostly your time and your knowledge, you have shared this with thousands of people around the world. And people might not realize how much of an impact that can have on the thousands of young children that come and take your tours, whether they remember the butterfly garden, a bird that they saw, or what doesn't matter. The fact is you're getting them outdoors, you're introducing them to nature. And when I grew up, that was easy. Nature was all around us. You know, we never got out of nature. Now you have to work to be in nature. And that's what you all do so well. And you've been so successful at it. And, you know, that grand opening that we had out there for the Nature Center, that's the biggest grand opening that anybody's seen until the grand opening we're to do at Selby Gardens here this week. But, you know, we had Audubon folks from all over. We had hundreds of people there that day because people understand the importance of this. And, you know, birds are unique because like those sea turtles, they got to have that beach, you know, to nest. And a lot of the animals, they can't go anyplace else. But the birds are more resilient. Not that they're not up against hard times, but they're more resilient. And to see, you know, when it was Celery Fields, the only bird I ever saw out there was, you know, a Cooper's hawk flying low or the sandhill cranes, which they were allowed to shoot them if they were eating their crop, you know, disturbing the crop. And to see what occurred there in a fairly short period of time with the diversity of bird types, I think is amazing to everyone. I mean, 220 species?
Mm-hmm.
And
250.
that's old data. You got that data from Scope several years ago. I know that
Yeah.
you've got to have more than 220 now. So, I mean,
And
I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you tonight, Sarasota Audubon. I appreciate what you do. And it's my pleasure to be here and share this little program with you. And history and nature are together. You know, we have to look at it that way. Humans are part of nature, and our interaction with nature is the key to everything. And we need to think more about that.
And John, you're such an important part, such an important contribution to that. Thank you so much for your presentation and your fine support of us all.
And have a good week at Selby. I'm
Yes.
sure you'll get many Auduboners there. So thanks, John. See you
You're
soon.
welcome. All righty.
Okay. Take
And I
care.
just put this up for next month. Come see us. Fascinating art of reading landscapes. So this is a great lead-in, John, for next month's talk as well.
Yes, and
Yeah.
we'll be talking much more about landscape and trees. And as you can see from the title, these trees tell a story, the art of reading landscapes. So please join us for this fascinating perspective.
All right.
Thank you.
Right.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. Wow, what a night.